What's up everybody, this is Master EN Gamer. Not too long ago we had the Junker Queen officially revealed as being the next hero coming to Overwatch 2, and during the Overwatch 2 reveal event, we got our first look at both her origin story and a proper animated short, both of which were absolutely awesome. So in today's video, I wanted to take an in-depth look at the Junker Queen specifically and focus on the story and lore aspects of this character, because we honestly learned quite a bit about the Queen, the Junkers, and even a potentially new upcoming PvE faction through both of these story-focused animated videos. There is quite a lot to delve into, so starting off, let's take a look at her origin story. Now, an important thing to preface when it comes to analyzing this origin story is that the overall video is told via a song. Of course, get all these cool visuals of the Junker Queen actually fighting Omnics and such, but the actual story information itself is being conveyed through the lyrics of the song being played, which I would play for you here, but maybe it'll get copyright struck, I don't exactly know. I'd rather not take the risk though. But the reason I want to emphasize that it's in the form of a song is that it gives the impression of the legend of the Junker Queen, which is literally how they describe the story being told, as being a sort of legend conveyed via a song, much like you would expect a bard in a fantasy setting to sing songs of ancient adventuring heroes and the like. And while this is not only a phenomenal way of conveying the story, it also carries with it an air of mysticism and makes the Junker Queen feel like a sort of mythical or legendary character, which both fits her, but also means that some of the information specified about her in this song and origin story might not be factually true. Right from the get-go, we can see some simply impossible imagery of her being a giant stone statue rising out of the desert, so obviously there is some exaggeration going on here, but that doesn't mean that everything is being completely fabricated, and it's the truth beneath these exaggerations which I think are most important to hone in on. So all that being said, now let's take a look at some of the juicy, possibly way over exaggerated details of the Junker Queen and the Junker faction as specified through her origin story. The first notable thing I'd like to point out is the mention of the Queen fighting Feral Omnics. Now, I don't believe we've ever heard the term Feral Omnics used before, but this seems to be how Blizzard is going to get away with, should we say, the idea of the Queen being incredibly anti-Omnic and literally slaughtering them in mass, as we see in this video, by saying that, oh, these Omnics? They're Feral Omnics, which somewhat softens the blow of the fact that she's effectively murdering hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Now, I don't doubt that there could be some legitimate in-universe explanations for how and why these Omnics are deemed feral. Perhaps they're like corrupted in a sense, perhaps due to some of the events which actually took place in the Australian outback, which I'll be getting onto in just a second. But it is worth noting that Feral Omnics does very much sound like a sort of title you'd expect for a generic, repetitive PvE enemy. Yes, that's all I'll say for now. I'll get onto those implications a little later in this video. But moving on to the next important detail from the origin story is the verse of the song where it's talked about how the Junker Queen ventured into the Burning Lands to break the curse of the 5 metal demons. This is perhaps the single most interesting bit of information we get out of the entire origin story. Never before have we heard of these 5 metal demons, but we can very clearly see them depicted here as basically colossal Omnics made out of scrap metal. The Burning Lands presumably are just the Wasteland Australian outback, but the curse aspect is another interesting element as well. What is the curse of the 5 metal demons? It could potentially just be a reference to the Omnics themselves and their mere existence. Given the current situation for the Junkers, and especially their origins as the Australian Liberation Front, who had to take their homeland back from the Omnics, it would make sense for these people to perceive the existence of the Omnics here as being a curse. And if we are to assume that these 5 metal demons are some sort of like Omnic overlords of some kind, or perhaps entities which operate the Omnium, where all the Omnics are coming from, or at least used to come from before it got blown up, then that would explain why defeating them would be perceived as such a noble and legendary feat. Also, despite the fact that the song says the Queen left these 5 to rust beneath the sand, I think there's a decent chance we see or hear more of these 5 as time goes on. These 5, I think, would make for some particularly interesting interesting bosses to fight in the PvE. In terms of size at least, they seem to be somewhat comparable to the Null Sector Titan, which we saw the Overwatch team fight against in the 0 Hour animated short, so perhaps somewhere in the PvE missions we'll end up seeing enemies similar to these things as well. The final important thing I want to focus on though from the origin story specifically is towards the end of the video when the queen herself starts singing, and she sings that she's fought off Omnics, Mutants, and Raiders. Now, Omnics and Raiders, those both make sense, but Mutants is a bit of a curious one. I don't believe we've ever actually had it officially stated anywhere that mutants were a thing which existed within the Overwatch universe, or at the very least, within the context of Australia and the Junkers. From a meta perspective, it certainly makes sense, given that it's pretty typical in pop culture for mutants to be associated with nuclear fallout, which is exactly what happened in the Overwatch universe in Australia. So the idea of there being mutants beyond just the Feral Omnics and whatever sort of human enemies exist, thematically at the very least, definitely makes sense. But it brings up the question then, who or what exactly are these mutants? There is one already established character though, who potentially I could see being a mutant, and that of course is Roadhog. Now, I'm far from the first person to have ever speculated on the idea of Roadhog being some sort of mutant. He's never shown his face before, always wears a mask, and seemingly needs to regularly consume hydrogen gas in order to survive or sustain himself. That's never really made particularly clear. But these elements, in addition to the fact that he's a pretty monstrously large individual, definitely seems to lead one to suspect that if there are mutants within the Overwatch universe, Roadhog is a pretty reasonable candidate for being one. Again though, it's possible that using the term mutants in this video is just part of the grandiose nature of it being a song about a legend, but it's certainly possible that there is something more to discern here in terms of the specific wording used. But moving on from the origin story, next up let's get into the animated short, which is where things start to get a bit more interesting and definitely play much more heavily into some of the potential new gameplay content I think we could end up seeing later down the line. So just to give a very quick recap of the events of this animated short, it begins with the Junker Queen, who at the time isn't yet the queen, having a flashback to when her family was kicked out of Junkertown 13 years ago. At this point, the one-day queen is still just a child, and we see her being kicked out of the city with her mother, father, and siblings. Now, there's some important information to discern from the dialogue here as well, which is that we hear a man's voice, presumably the Junker Queen's father, speaking to the current king of Junkertown, which is Mason Howl, and claiming that the two of them fought in a war together. Now, it's unclear which war is specifically being referred to here. It's possible that both of them are Omnic Crisis veterans and thus fought on a sort of global level against the Omnics overall, but it's also possible that he's referring simply to the Australian Liberation Front and their fight against the Omnics in the more localized area of just Australia. Also, I guess I should mention just a brief history lesson for those of you who aren't necessarily caught up on the backstory of Australia in the Overwatch universe. After the Omnic Crisis came to an end, the Australian government basically gifted a bunch of land from the outback to the Omnics and the Omnium that was there as a sort of peace deal arrangement, but in the process ended up displacing many of the Australians who already lived there. These displaced people ended up forming the Australian Liberation Front, who fought back against the Omnics to retake their land, which ultimately led to the destruction of the Omnium, the big nuclear blast, and all the fallout and wasteland stuff that followed. So again, we don't know which war specifically the Queen's father and King Howl necessarily fought in. Could have been the Omnic Crisis, could have been the Australian Liberation Front battles, could have been something else entirely, but at the very least, it emphasizes a significant connection between the Queen, and specifically her father, and the current leader of Junkertown. Moving on from this flashback though, we get into the main substance of the animated short, which is the battle in the Scrapyard, where basically the Queen has to fight against two opponents, being a Junker cyborg named Geiger and a woman in a mech named Mary. Now, Geiger specifically doesn't really get any development or have much of a character here, but Mary, on the other hand, we do get a bit of information regarding. Based on the way the Queen and Mary speak to each other during the battle, it sounds like they already knew each other preemptively, which seems to then indicate that the two have some form of history together. And it's also mentioned that Mary apparently runs the Tinkers. Now, the Tinkers is a name which we've never specifically heard before, but just based on the name of it and the design of Mary and her mech, mech, it's pretty safe to assume that this is probably some sort of engineers guild of some form or another, since we do know there are at least a few engineers who live in Junkertown. Bruce is the other main example of this, who we saw in Roadhog's comic a number of years ago, so perhaps both Bruce and Mary are a part of this Tinkerers Guild or group or something along those lines, with Mary being the person who runs it. After effectively defeating both her opponents, though, the Queen then turns her focus to the King of Junkertown and basically goads him into fighting her as well, which he does so quite recklessly, such that he nearly kills both Mary and Geiger, who the Queen had previously spared, thus ultimately resulting in Mary turning sides and assisting the Junker Queen in taking down the King. However, during this, we get another very brief flashback to when the Queen was still a child, where we see her standing with her mother and siblings over what is presumably her father's grave. This seems to give a pretty solid reasoning behind why the Queen has now come back to Junkertown to take on King Howl, because obviously she blames him for her father's death. Ultimately, though, the Queen does end up defeating the King, and rather than executing him on the spot, decides to spare him, and instead banish him to the Wasteland, just as he'd done to her family 13 years prior. We then get a montage of the Queen being the Queen of Junkertown, where she's yelling at locals, beating up people in the streets, and helping kids learn how to throw knives, with some of these stills even having Roadhog and Wrecking Ball cameos, especially this one where we can see Wrecking Ball straight up riding his mech alongside the Junker Queen, who herself is in a rather familiar looking bike and sidecar. Yes, this appears to be Roadhog's chopper. Now, it does have a different color scheme, and the little icon on the front is a crown instead of the smiley face we normally see on Roadhog's bike, but I'm willing to bet that this is probably the same vehicle. So perhaps there's going to be some interesting story developments there between the Queen and Roadhog that ultimately lead to Roadhog coming to possess her motorcycle. Again, something we may or may not end up learning more about later down the line, but for now is a fun detail to take note of. Now, having recapped the animated short and the important details from it, the key thing I'd like to focus on at this point is the ending of the animated short, where we see the former king Mason Howl banished to the Wasteland. Seeing that the former king is still alive definitely brings up some new hero questions. Perhaps we'll see this character return as a playable hero at some point later down the line in Overwatch 2, and while it is certainly possible, I think it's even more likely that we see him returning specifically as a boss in PvE. And how I think that's going to work is that Mason Howl is going to end up joining forces with the Feral Omnics. Now, Blizzard has stated previously that there will be more factions we fight against in the PvE missions than just Talon and Null Sector, and after having now seen the Junker Queen's origin story and animated short, I absolutely think that they're building up the Feral Omnics of the Australian Wasteland to be another enemy PvE faction. And with the former king of Junkertown now booted into the Wasteland, I think he's the perfect candidate for teaming up with these Omnics, given that both the former king and the Omnics clearly hate the current Junker Queen. Honestly, the story missions for this scenario just write themselves. With the Queen's Edition, we now have 4 proper Junker heroes, being the Queen, Wrecking Ball, Roadhog, and Junkrat. So boom, right there, you got 4 heroes that could work as a team in a 4-player PvE story campaign. Perhaps these PvE missions will include venturing into the Wasteland to find other little pockets of Omnics hanging out who are maybe trying to resurrect the 5 metal demons or something like that. Or maybe there'll be more defensive focused missions where you have to protect Junkertown itself from onslaughts of attacking raiders and Feral Omnics. Now, I could talk quite extensively about potential PvE missions in this regard, so I'll probably save further discussion of that topic for its own separate video at some point, but absolutely I think it's safe to say now that this origin story and animated short have laid the groundwork for a new Feral Omnic PvE faction. And one final little trivia, I guess, tidbit of information we also learned from this animated short was that the Junker Queen's actual name is Odessa Des Stone. I was honestly curious whether we'd actually end up getting an official name for the Queen, or if Blizzard was going to want to intentionally keep her real identity a bit mysterious, but no, it looks like they've gone ahead and given her a proper name, although it does sound like she's probably just going to be referred to as either Junker Queen or simply Queen as a hero in-game. game. And that does it for my Junker Queen lore and story analysis. Thank you all so much for watching. Definitely let me know your thoughts on anything I talked about here today down in the comments below. Are you curious to learn more about the Feral Omnics and the 5 metal demons of the Wasteland? Or maybe you're curious to see what sort of PvE enemies and factions might emerge from the characters we've been introduced to here. Either way, I'd love to hear from you, and thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, follow me on Twitter, hit up that bell icon, and come join my Discord server to hang out and never miss any of my future Overwatch content. Special thanks to my YouTube channel members who help make these videos possible, and if you'd like to join them to earn some cool rewards, then just hit that join button down below. Otherwise, this is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.